All right, y'all, with JJK 271 now officially out and the series concluded, let's dive into some of y'all's final questions and thoughts on this chapter. All right, y'all, to kick things off today, I have gotten so much love and support from people who are just sharing their thanks and appreciation without even asking a question or sharing a theory or anything like that. So I want to say thank you guys so much. And I'm grouping these together to spare you guys from the awkwardness of me separately responding to these 15 times because I'm awkward and can't take a compliment. And so nobody wants to see that. So special shout out to Echo, Branwin, Lily, Lactose, Teriyaki, Skew Hoop, and Tofu. Thank you guys so much for the kind words. And yeah, wearing the suit for 24 hours, it was worth it. This is a once in a lifetime thing, the finale of JJK, right? We had to do it big. And also, Lily, thank you for stopping by the Twitch streams. That has been really fun, and you guys have really showed out for those. So I appreciate y'all. And continuing on that trend, we got 3 more here that are just showing love. So big shout out to Dobbs, Flash, and Eclipse. And Flash, insanely generous donation, man. I wanted to make sure that you didn't have a question or anything to go with this because you did include your Instagram handle. I went over there and checked. I didn't have any messages, so I shot you one, and I just wanted to make sure that you didn't have a question. So if you did, feel free to respond, and we can get that taken care of. And then Eclipse, this is my first donation from Iceland. At least I'm pretty sure, and that is extremely cool to me because I have been to Iceland twice. It's the most beautiful place I have ever been, so I'm jealous that you get to be there 24/7. Thank you so much for the generous support. Next up, we got this from Cream Car, and y'all can pause to read. It's just more kind words, so thank you so much, man. But let's head over to part 2 where the question is. So Cream Car's question is, do you think Takaba used a domain expansion in his fight with Kenjaku? And honestly, no, I don't. But you do bring up some good points, how in that Kenjaku fight, we see a lot more from Comedian than we had ever seen previously. But I don't think that's the results of a domain expansion, because I think Gege would have showed us, like, Takaba casting domain expansion. I don't think he would have, like, shied away from that. Plus, I think we would have seen Kenjaku at least try to counter it. I don't think he would have, like, subjected himself to that just to see what it was, necessarily. So I think it was just the effects of Comedian. Basically, we're getting to see it in full force for the first time, since it was just kind of like little tidbits prior to. So could it have been the domain? Maybe, but I do think Gege would have like made sure we knew that if it had been the case. Next up, we got a couple questions from Scarlett here about Mahito. The first being, what are my thoughts on him being back and what Gege wanted his purpose to be when talking to Sukuna? And what are my thoughts on the Pathway Soul's walk that he mentioned? So, and not that you were saying this, but I don't think Mahito is back per se. I think that is just kind of a remnant of himself that he left via his curse technique. Almost like a parasite on maybe Sukuna or Yuji's soul so that he could converse with them in that moment of their death or whatever we want to call it, right? So I thought that was a really clever application of the technique and a really cool way to get Mahito back in the final chapter as one of the most iconic villains and also, another mirror to Yuji, the same way Sukuna was, right? So I love that he brought him back in that way. And the purpose of it, I think, was to show the distinction between somebody like Mahito, a curse, and somebody like Sukuna, who is is actually human, even though he is the king of curses, right? So I liked it. It showed the difference between them, how Sukuna was choosing north in a new path, as opposed to somebody like Mahito, who is stuck in their ways, right? And my thoughts on the pathway, I think it's just representative of like Buddhist concepts mostly, but not necessarily exactly that, but the cycle of kind of reincarnation or rebirth, or just, the perpetual cycle that all life goes through. Digging into it further than that, I don't know, but I think that's basically what it was representative of. And then can I do a recap of the Hunter x Hunter anime? Maybe. If I get time, I did want to do a recap of the manga that takes place after the anime ends and where the manga is about to pick up this week. So that's got priority for me now. But then if people want it, at some point, I probably could do a recap of the Hunter x Hunter anime as well. But that would probably be a little bit further down the line. Next up, we got this from Dim Ninjas, who's sharing his thoughts on the ending, saying it's not perfect, but he liked the closure with Sukuna. And I agree. I thought Sukuna's ending was really well done, and I really enjoyed it. And I'm actually going to be putting out a standalone video talking about just that specifically. So be on the lookout for that. But yeah, I agree. I like that his ideology was beaten in the end, and Yuji was the one to teach him about love. Next up, we got some thoughts from Can't Think of a Name, who says that he feels like the whole Kenjaku thing almost has to lead to a sequel, not only because of the weird Takaba stuff, but also because we saw Yuta able to survive being in a foreign body and then able to get back to his original body. And he says if Yuta can do that, why can't Kenjaku? And I think there are some important differences here. One is that Yuta didn't die in Gojo's body. He just passed out because the curse technique got shut off, right? Kenjaku very clearly got like messed up by Yuta. So I wouldn't say those two circumstances are the same. But for the sake of argument, let's just say they are, right? I still don't think that that means Kenjaku could just get back in the same way Yuta did because Yuta had Rika. And I'm pretty sure Rika is the only reason any of this was possible because we know that Rika was like channeling RCT and keeping Yuta alive the entire time he was over in Gojo's body. So without something akin to that in Kenjaku's case, I don't think we can assume that he would just be capable of that same type of feat. But the Takaba stuff is interesting. And, since the series is over now, my best guess is to chalk that up to a gag. Like somebody else that Takaba just had dress up like Geto for the sake of their comedy routine. But should, Gege ever do a sequel at some point down the road or something, maybe something could develop with that. And then finally, the my will live on. I think that was in reference to how he passed on Tengen to Sukuna. So I do think that at least was fulfilled. Next up, we got this from Thomas, and y'all pause to read, but he essentially wants to know if I think Gojo is truly dead. And honestly, yes. Now, you bring up some great points, a lot of the ones that we've talked about in the lead up to the finale of JJK, a lot of the ambiguity and just absence of information about him. It is still strange, but now that we've seen the last chapter, I think that makes more sense with what Gege was trying to do, basically speaking through Gojo in that final chapter, like wanting people to forget about him, not in like a pity me kind of way, but just because that's the vision he had for the future. So I think part of that can be attributed to Gege trying to like build that atmosphere in the lead up to the final chapter. So yeah, I do believe he is dead because I think that just makes the most sense at this point since the series is over. But again, these are good points, like I mentioned. Thomas then goes on to say that he thinks Gege did things this way because he wanted to end JJK, but he wasn't sure if he would ever come back to it. So this way he kind of leaves his options open by making things ambiguous. And I do think that's a fair point. But, at least right now it doesn't seem like Gege wants to continue JJK. But 2, 5, 10 years down the road, who knows, right? If he picks it back up, maybe he could, bring back Gojo since it was so ambiguous. But I think if he did that now, it would really cheapen things that happened in the end of part 1. So I don't know if I would like it at this point, but it's definitely possible. And again, with as popular as JJK and Gojo are, sometimes those dollar signs might just come calling. So who knows? Next up, we got some thoughts from EDG on the ending of JJK, and y'all pause to read this because I really like how you put this. I think you make some fantastic points about how JJK through and through had been a story that had had these great twists and dark moments, and so a lot of people expected to get another big dose of that in the finale, or at least hoped to, right? So the fact that we didn't can be very disappointing, and I 100% understand that. You guys know that I wanted the merger to happen. I was hoping we would get a merger arc, which would have been incredibly dark, right? And probably would have meant there had been some twist with Kenjaku still to fall. That didn't happen. Again, in a perfect world, I would have loved to have seen that, but that just isn't the ending we were going for. It was actually a much happier and uplifting and optimistic ending to JJK, which is typical for a shonen and honestly probably, what most people should have expected. But again, JJK being such kind of a twist on some typical shonen norms had people expecting that of the ending as well. So totally get that. But again, I did like the ending. I liked it. And again, I don't want to jump into this whole argument again, but that doesn't mean I liked everything about it. That doesn't mean I think it was perfect, but there are definitely aspects that I liked. I loved Gojo's characterization at the end. I loved Sukuna's, and I loved the fact that Gojo's dream came true. But anyways, yes, I love this write-up you did, and I agree. Next up, we got this from Digimete, and y'all pause to read it, but he's sharing his thoughts on the ending, saying that he actually really loved it. And you know what? I really did love elements of it as well. And I wish that that's the nuance we could have in the community. Like, it doesn't have to be that you're an infinite glazer or a toxic douche lord, all right? Like, you just talk about what we like and what we don't like about it. So again, I appreciate this commentary. And he says that he might get a tattoo of that final page and wants to know if I plan on getting any JJK tattoos. I don't have any tattoos right now, but I do do want some at some point in my life, and JJK might have to have an influence on that when it happens. All right, so next up, we're continuing on the ending commentary, this time from Eric. So y'all pause to read it, but he is specifically talking about the ending to Gojo's story. And the more he thinks about it, the more he likes it. And yeah, I honestly really love the conclusion to Gojo's narrative arc. Yes, he didn't come back. It wasn't a like happy ending in that sense, but I do think it was still just poetic and beautiful. And the way Gege kind of did have that ambiguity around him, I do think makes more sense given what Gojo said at the end, that he wanted to be forgotten. The world that produced him, he was trying to wipe clean, right? And we saw that happen. And we saw that even though he wanted people to forget him, those closest to him never would, just like Yuji said. And we even get the full-on showcasing of that with Yuji passing down the same empathy and lessons that Gojo gave to him when he was talking to the curse user. And I do plan on making a full standalone video talking about the Gojo stuff, so I'll dive more into it there, but I'm right there with you. It wasn't necessarily the happiest possible ending with Gojo, but that doesn't mean it wasn't still great. Next up, we got this from Hubba, who says he thinks the main reason people are upset are because things that didn't happen that they wanted to. But he believes that part of those unused plot lines could be left open to leave room for a part 2. And I totally agree. I felt like a lot of 271 was left kind of with the potential of the door still open. Now, again, I don't think Gege is immediately jumping into a part 2 or anything, but who knows down the road. Next up, we got this from Blue Eyed King, and y'all pause to read, but they said they love the story from start to finish, but the one thing they're bummed about is Gojo. And not that he didn't come back, but that like the students didn't talk more about it, that he didn't have more of an impact in those final chapters in terms of, you know, a funeral or whatever the case may be. And as I'm sure you'll know, I agree that ambiguity was very strange in the final chapters. But now that we've seen 271, it makes more sense to me. It was intentional from Gege. Now, just because it was intentional doesn't mean you can't dislike it or you wish it had gone another way. I totally understand that. But I now at least understand what Gege was doing by creating that ambiguity. Because Gojo wanted to be forgotten, right? The world, the society that led to the necessitation of a Gojo Satoru is what he wanted to tear down and destroy and create the new way, lays up the next generation of good and strong allies, right? Which he was successful in doing. Gojo won, like he did it. So it was very optimistic and happy in that sense. And I feel like he found peace with himself before that final battle. And like I mentioned, I'm going to make a whole video talking about Gojo, so I won't get too long-winded here. But I totally understand what you're talking about. I just think that it was intentional from Gege. And even though we did have all of that, you know, non-mention of him, I think in the final chapter it was revealed that of course they're not going to forget him, just like Yuji said, and just like we see Gojo's impact living on through Yuji. Next up, Sip says, do you think it's possible Sukuna had such a terrible childhood due to his strange features after absorbing his twin? And 100%. Can you even imagine like that he would have just been treated like an absolute outcast, a cursed, unwanted little wretch, you know, his own words. So I think that's absolutely why he was shunned and excommunicated, which gave him the entire chip on his shoulder that Mahito points out in the final chapter, right? You were after revenge against the world that, you know, tossed you aside. So yeah, I think that you know, definitely helps explain it at the very least. And it is ironic that those very things are what made him such a proficient jujutsu sorcerer. So yeah, I really loved Sukuna's whole story. Next up, we got OG Ghosty's thoughts on the ending, so y'all pause to read it as well, but he says this final chapter was genuinely almost perfect, and he thinks all of the weird Gojo stuff now makes sense in light of the last chapter. And just like I was talking about a couple of questions ago, I completely agree. Next up, Draco asks, do you think there still might be an additional special chapter? And so, yes, but let me clarify. So back before 271 dropped, in part of the announcements that they talked about for JJK, they said there would be an additional special chapter. However, I really don't think that's going to be JJK 272, which means I don't know if we'd get like narrative like tie-ups or anything like that. I wouldn't expect any further answers really. You know, just given the nature of announcements and things hyped up by Shonen Jump, I would definitely keep your expectations in the gutter. And then if we did get something like that, great. But, you know, I would just imagine it's probably fluff as opposed to, you know, actual content, but we'll see. Next up, Reaper asks, I gotta know, did you already have a suit in your closet or did you rent one for the occasion? And no, that was my suit. I have a couple of suits. You know, when you get to the age where a bunch of your friends start getting married and stuff, it's good to just have one because renting one over and over, that can really add up. Next up, we got some final thoughts from Suraj here, who first does some very kind words, so thank you for that. But then says that he really enjoyed this manga, but he wished we just got a little more Heian era or Sukuna backstory, maybe some more about Kenjaku, or a bigger climax between Yuji and Sukuna. And I totally understand these criticisms. I mean, me personally, I would have eaten up a Heian era flashback just to dive more into the world building and lore of that era, would have been incredible. But for whatever reason, Gege wanted to end the story here. I think JJK could have gone another 200, 300 chapters if he wanted to, explore all of these various things. But again, for whatever reason, he didn't. This is where he wanted to end the story. So, I think it is a sign of something that we all really enjoyed, that we're left wanting more, which, isn't. I understand people being upset by that, but I do stand firmly on the fact that I would much rather leave a story wanting more than leave a story wishing it had ended 100 chapters prior, because it's just in the dregs now. So, maybe we'll get a part two one day, maybe we won't, but on the whole and whole, I'm very happy with JJK. Next up, we got this from Bunger, who points out, have I noticed the JJK dub mistranslation when Sukuna fights Maharaga? Because he says, you can see it, Maharaga, you can see my curse technique. But at that point, he would have had no idea who Maharaga's name was. And yeah, I actually had never thought about that, but you're right. In the manga, he doesn't refer to Maharaga by name in that moment. He just says, you can see my curse technique. So I imagine they just did that kind of as like an acting thing, like the voice actor just kind of, helped him with the delivery. It was an iconic moment in the dub. So I imagine it's just kind of one of those things. Next up, we got this from Maybe Ronan, who wants to know who would win in this hypothetical matchup, Virgil from the Devil May Cry series or the entire JJK roster. And honestly, I only played the original Devil May Cry, so I'm not going to be up to date on all of that lore. But I think the JJK roster wins, like, especially if you're considering like all of them at once, which maybe isn't what you were saying. But if that's the case, then I feel like just overwhelmingly they would be able to beat him. But if it's a one-on-one basis, I think Virgil could take a vast majority of the JJK verse, but I don't know how he's getting through Infinity. But again, I'm not up to date on the lore of DMC, so maybe you DMC fans out there, you can let us know in the comments who would actually win here. But I'm not sure how he's going to get past Gojo, and I don't know how he necessarily gets past certain domain expansions either, assuming the domain expansions get off. But if Virgil just slices everybody down before they get the chance, then maybe he can take out most of them. But again, Gojo would be a problem. Next up, we got this from OK, who's sharing his thoughts on the ending. Y'all pause to read, and his big criticism of Gege is that he has an out-of-sight, out-of-mind writing style, where we won't get development on some of these side characters unless they are explicitly relevant. And I would agree with this criticism. I do think it's one of Gege's weaknesses as a writer, that I do think he can develop side characters very well, especially in certain points, but unless they are like having the spotlight on them, they do kind of suffer. So yeah, I agree with that. I think that is one of the things I wish we had gotten more, was more like interpersonal developments between more of the side cast. So yeah, I agree with you. Next up, we got some more ending thoughts from Ant. So as always, y'all pause to read it. But he says, it's not the ending we may have wanted, but it's the one we got. And then goes on to point out a lot of the positive things about the ending. So this is basically my stance as well. In the perfect world, would I have had things maybe play out slightly differently or gotten more emphasis here rather than there? 100%. But even still, I really loved some of the things about this ending. But, I've talked about that. We'll be putting more videos out about specific things. So I'll leave it there for now. But I agree with you, man, and thank you for the kind words. All right, so next up we got this from Music, who says, I'm just now realizing how the ending is basically a replay of Hidden Inventory. Gojo is once more fighting a Fushiguro, but this time it's inverted. Instead of a heavenly restricted opponent with no cursed energy, he's fighting the king of curses, the master of jujutsu, right? And instead of helping a merger happen in, protecting Riko, he is instead trying to prevent a merger from happening. And instead of coming back as the honored one, he temporarily comes back as Yuta. So yeah, I love these parallels. JJK has been full of this cyclical storytelling where moments are kind of repeating in sometimes slightly different ways. So I love this. Next up, we got this from Cam with no question or theory, just some very kind words. So thank you so much, man. It's been my absolute joy and honor to be able to create this content and experience this journey with y'all. Next up, we got this from Simple. Y'all pause to read it, but he's basically sharing how the ending made him like Sukuna so much more. And I agree that that was one of the highlights of the ending, that moment between Mahito and Sukuna, and seeing Sukuna finally change his ways because somebody did get through to him. Yuji, he was defeated, right? And like I mentioned, I am going to make a standalone video talking about Sukuna because Simple asked me if I could go over his full character arc and evolution. So that is coming. I've already started working on it, and I will try to remember to ping you on Discord once I'm done with it so that you know. But thank you so much, man. Next up, I got a couple of cash apps with no comment whatsoever from Leon and from Matt. So I don't know if you were just sending in some support or maybe this was an accident and you meant to include a question. So if you did, please reach out to me via DM on TikTok or Instagram or Discord and let me know your cash app name so that I know that it's you. Next up, we got this question from Dorian about Rika. So y'all pause to read it, but he's basically saying, since we're using this headcanon that Rika is kind of neither fully cursed spirit nor fully Shikigami, do I think that Geto's cursed spirit manipulation would be able to absorb her? And if so, would they be able to get access to everything Yuta could do? Like, would they get access to the copy curse technique, essentially? And this is a really interesting thought experiment because original Rika from JJK 0 was a true cursed spirit, right? And we know that Geto was planning to absorb her. So that much is certain. Geto could have absorbed original Rika. Now, again, this new Rika, we don't really know what she is. So I don't know if Geto would be able to absorb that. I would still probably lean yes, because I feel like the closest approximation for what Rika is still quote unquote curse more than quote unquote Shikigami, even though effectively she probably functions more like a Shikigami. So I don't know. If you made me pick, I would guess that Kenjaku / Geto probably could absorb Rika if they got the opportunity to, but maybe not. But again, hypothetically, if they did, would they get all of the powers? I don't think so. I think they would get a majority of the powers. Like they would get the things Rika represent insofar as, you know, the boundless cursed energy and just being like a storage for cursed tools and all that jazz. But I don't know if they would be able to copy techniques in the same way because it's always been kind of ambiguous how Yuta's curse technique works. In the fan book, his curse technique is listed as Rika, not as copy. So there's definitely an argument to be made that Geto / Kenjaku would gain access to the copy technique. But I think Yuta has to have some role in that whole equation. So I don't think they would necessarily get everything. But, you know, I think, again, there's an argument to be made either way, to be honest. Next up, Alfredo says, what if Takada is Gege's idol for his next manga? And I think that would be peak, honestly, especially if we got like a Toto guest appearance as like her bodyguard or maybe boyfriend at some point. I honestly don't think that will happen, but I'd read it. Next up, we got this from Big Z, who sent me his thoughts on chapter 271 and wanted to get my reaction to it. And his thoughts were in the form of a like 20-minute long YouTube video, so that's why I'm not going to include it in this video. But man, I will respond to you kind of in a more in-depth basis on Discord, but just in general, I completely agree with you, man. It seems like we are very much of the same mind when it comes to JJK and the ending specifically. As I'm sure you know, I liked it as well. That doesn't mean it was perfect. That doesn't mean I wish we hadn't gotten more in this subject or more in this subject. But for what it was, for the story Gege was trying to tell, I really enjoyed this ending. I think there are very beautiful parts of this ending, specifically in regards to Gojo and Sukuna's development and the realization of Gojo's dream and the now shape of Jujutsu Society. So yeah, I really enjoyed your thoughts, and I'm gonna ask Big Z if it's okay if I share the link to his video, and if so, I will include it down in the comments for anybody that wants to check it out. We got this from Brandon, who says, my question is, what do you think about Gojo admitting to Yuji that he might not win, or did you not interpret it that way? So how I interpreted that scene was not Gojo necessarily resigning to the fact that he would lose, or even necessarily expecting that he would lose, but just coming to peace with that idea. I think Gojo really did have an epiphany, for a lack of a better word, an acceptance of kind of where he was in the world, what he was able to accomplish, accomplished, the fact that he was surrounded by all of these strong and good allies that he had sought to cultivate for the majority of his adult life, and that he found peace in that he knew what his role was in this fight, and he could walk into it confidently, giving it everything he had because he knows the next generation was set up to accomplish and, exceed him in all of the ways that he hoped they would. So I didn't take it as like, again, an acceptance of an inevitable defeat or anything, but more so just an acceptance of whatever was going to happen because he went into it with everything he had and he was confident in what the future was going to hold for the rest. Next up, Isaiah says, what's your favorite JJK fight and why? And honestly, it has to be Gojo Sukuna, just because for so many reasons. Like, first of all, just the communal experience around those fights, the leak nights, and just the hype and discussion chapter to chapter with the different cliffhangers and trying to piece together, like, what was going to happen next was so fun. And then just in world, getting to see the two gods of this verse go head to head and how they were both creatively trying to get one up on the other through the like 6 domain clashes or however many it was just so peak and so exciting and so much fun. But I know that's going to be like the default answer for everyone, so let me give you a few honorable mentions as well. And for that, I got to go Hikari Kashimo, just because it was so cool to see Jackpot in full force out and about and seeing how that domain operated a little bit more. Other than that, anytime that Toto and Yuji jump somebody, that was always so peak. You guys know that Toto is one of my favorites, so I loved that. I love seeing Boogie Woogie in action. And then finally, Takaba versus Kenjaku, I thought was just so extremely creative and such a fun way to treat a fight of that magnitude. So I liked that a lot as well. Y'all, that's all for this one. Thank you guys so much for the support on this video, but also all throughout JJK. And I don't imagine I still won't get more JJK questions on occasion or, especially when the anime comes back. But seeing as this is the last like bulk video with questions about a chapter, I just wanted to one more time say thank you guys for just all of the support. It truly meant the world to me. And as always, thank you so much for watching.